Let's take a step back and look at this carefully. When the Ukraine war is discussed, it often begins in 2022. But if we start there, almost everything that explains why it happened is missed. To understand this conflict, history, geography, security fears, and global power politics all need to be considered together. Different countries acted as they did not because they were irrational, but because they believed they were protecting their interests. After the Cold War ended in 1991, the world didn't reset to zero. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Ukraine became independent. For Ukraine, this was freedom, the right to decide its own political system, economy, and alliances. For Russia, the collapse was experienced very differently. It meant the loss of territory, influence, buffer zones, and global status. Ukraine wasn't just another neighbor. It was deeply tied to Russian history, industry, and security planning. At the same time, Western institutions began expanding. NATO and the European Union welcomed countries that had spent decades under Soviet control. For countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, NATO membership wasn't about threatening Russia. It was about survival. These countries remembered invasions, repression, and abandonment. Joining NATO meant never being alone again. NATO didn't force these countries to join. They applied, repeatedly and deliberately. From Russia's perspective, NATO expansion looked very different. NATO was originally created to counter the Soviet Union. Even if NATO described itself as defensive, Russia experienced its expansion as strategic pressure. As NATO moved closer to Russian borders, fear in Moscow wasn't abstract. It was about military access, reaction time, and loss of strategic depth. This wasn't paranoia. It was security logic shaped by history. There is also the question of the so-called promise not to expand NATO eastward. In 1990, during negotiations over German reunification, Western leaders made verbal assurances. But these were never written into a binding treaty. They applied specifically to East Germany, not to all of Eastern Europe. Legally, NATO did not violate a formal agreement, but geopolitics doesn't run on law alone. From Russia's point of view, trust was broken. Ukraine stood at the center of all this. For years, it tried to balance relations with both Russia and the West. Internally, it was divided, politically, culturally, and economically. Some regions leaned toward Europe, others toward Russia. This made Ukraine unstable and vulnerable to outside influence. In 2014, the balance collapsed. Mass protests erupted after the president moved away from a European agreement and closer to Russia. Ukraine saw this as a popular uprising against corruption and authoritarianism. Russia saw it as a Western-backed political shift threatening its security. Same event, two very different interpretations. Soon after, Russia took control of Crimea. To understand why Crimea mattered so much, it is necessary to look beyond ideology. Crimea hosts Sevastopol, Russia's most important warm-water naval base. Without it, the Black Sea Fleet is weakened. Access to the Mediterranean is restricted. There is also history. Crimea was part of Russia until 1954, when it was transferred to Ukraine during the Soviet era. At the time, it felt administrative, but it became geopolitical after independence. From Russia's perspective, taking Crimea was about strategic security, military access, and correcting a historical mistake. From Ukraine's perspective, and most of the world's, it was illegal. A violation of sovereignty. After Crimea, trust collapsed almost completely. Between 2014 and 2021, the conflict never truly stopped. Fighting continued in eastern Ukraine. Russia denied direct involvement. Ukraine accused Russia of supporting separatists. At the same time, Ukraine moved closer to NATO politically, if not formally. For Russia, Ukraine no longer felt neutral. For Ukraine, neutrality no longer felt safe. By 2021, positions were hardening. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine on a large scale. Russia framed the invasion as preemptive, to stop NATO expansion, to protect Russian-speaking populations, and to force a new security arrangement in Europe. Ukraine framed it as existential, to preserve independence, sovereignty, and the right to choose its future. Both narratives exist. Both are deeply believed depending on perspective. At this point, the war stopped being just about Ukraine and Russia. The United States and Europe responded with weapons, intelligence, funding, and sanctions. but not troops. This approach served multiple goals simultaneously: supporting Ukraine, defending international norms, weakening a strategic rival without direct confrontation. Geopolitics rarely operates with a single motive. Other countries reacted based on their own interests. Europe faced an energy shock and a security rethink. Germany rearmed. Finland and Sweden abandoned neutrality. China watched carefully, avoiding full alignment while learning lessons for its own future. India took a pragmatic path, calling for peace while maintaining ties with Russia. Much of the global south remained neutral, seeing the conflict as a power struggle between blocs rather than a moral crusade. The war reshaped global alignments far beyond Europe. On the ground, the human cost continued to rise. Ukraine faced destroyed cities, displacement, and an economy transformed into survival mode. Russia faced sanctions, isolation, and long-term economic pressure. Globally, food prices rose, energy markets destabilized, and the idea that major war was a thing of the past disappeared. Today, the war has become a grinding stalemate. Ukraine depends heavily on external support. Russia depends on endurance and adaptation. Both sides believe time may work in their favor. Crimea remains the hardest obstacle. Ukraine cannot give it up without undermining sovereignty. Russia cannot give it up without losing strategic credibility. This single peninsula ties together history, military power, identity, and global norms. Where does this go? A decisive military victory looks unlikely. A frozen conflict is possible. A negotiated settlement may come, but only after exhaustion reshapes expectations. Wars shaped by geopolitics rarely end with moral clarity. They end when costs outweigh beliefs. Understanding this war requires accepting its complexity. It is not a simple story of heroes and villains. It is a collision of history, fear, ambition, and power. With ordinary people bearing the heaviest cost, the war isn't just about Ukraine or Russia. It is about how the world handles power transitions, security fears, and unresolved historical grievances. If this explanation helps make sense of why countries acted as they did, liking the video and subscribing supports more content like this. And if there are other conflicts or global issues worth unpacking, the comments are the place to explore them. Understanding doesn't guarantee peace, but without it, repetition is almost certain. The next chapters could explore NATO's future role, China's position, and economic and political shifts caused by the war. The lesson is that history, fear, and strategy drive decisions. And every action triggers a reaction. Crimea, NATO expansion, and Ukraine's sovereignty are pieces of the same complex puzzle. Before we end, if this video helped make sense of a complicated and emotional conflict, and if the balanced, no shouting approach felt different from the usual headlines, please consider liking the video. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people. If you'd like more explainers that look at global conflicts from every side, without turning them into simple good versus bad stories, subscribe to the channel. And if you disagree, agree, or see this conflict differently, the comments are open. That's where real understanding begins. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.